Welcome to the Top 12 Highlights from Chapter 3 as we take a look at American federalism. I'm Mr. Rodman taking you through the top 12 highlights. And here we go. Let's talk about federalism, that handshake between national and state government working together in order to get things done. We talked about this with Hurricane Harvey, with Hurricane Irma, and the work between the state and the national government in terms of getting things done. The local government also having a role, but not a constitutional one. Local government getting all of their power from the states. Constitutionally, national and state government included, local government not mentioned. But that is the constitutional arrangement of federalism, a sharing of power. Now, what type of federalism do we have? We see a number of types of federalism. Let's talk about them for a second. Dual federalism is this idea that each level of government kind of has its own sphere, and that these powers are somewhat limited. Think of it like a layer cake. You've got two different layers that are kind of interspersed in different ways, but there is some sharing of power going on. Cooperative federalism is this idea that the different levels are actually working together in terms of delivering these types of services in disasters are a great example of this, because this is the response to Hurricane Harvey or Hurricane Irma. In terms of the responsiveness to Houston or to Florida, this is the cooperative type of thing we're talking about here. Now, marble cake is when all of these are kind of engaged, and it's really a mixing up of those responsibilities. Not quite the same layer that we see in dual, or it's still cooperative, but there are different levels of that responsibility, where the national government does more or less, and the state government or local government back and forth. So it really is an intermixing of the level of responsibility there. And then we have permissive federalism, this idea that the federal government is giving permission to the states in terms of roles to get done. Now, we see more of a sharing of power than permissive federalism in terms of what's out there in American government today. But from time to time, and a good example of this is the state wants to sue the national government. We see permissive federalism in stating through the Bill of Rights that the government is allowed to be sued in that regard. But for the most part, we don't see where states are dependent on the federal government as much in terms of permission, more in terms of cash. If the S's in permission are dollar signs, then yes, that would be permissive federalism. But we see a lot more devolution today in terms of where this government power is being passed down, a trend we have seen develop since 40 years or 50 years ago. This idea is passing down the responsibility and in many times pushing the money back to first order devolution, this idea that the national law is kind of pushed to the state governments and letting the states kind of handle it from there. Hey, this is something that the states should be doing. Second order devolution says, well, the states push it down to the local government and saying, hey, the local governments and charitable groups should handle this. And then third order devolution is the local government basically passing it off to charitable organizations, nonprofits, churches, other groups, and really this is where we start to see it fall through the cracks. Things that are getting passed down through these orders of devolution are really ultimately falling through the cracks and nothing gets done until a big something bad happens and a big to-do is made of it in the media, and then the process starts all over again. Then the national government steps in. Hurricane Katrina, to some extent, was like that in terms of everybody passing it off to somebody else, nobody really kind of thinking in terms of what needs to get done, and meanwhile, you know, ice trucks are sitting in St. Louis, and nobody can get into New Orleans, and it's all just one big mess. And then, of course, the media focus on it, and then the national government says, "Hey, we need to take more responsibility here and have a better plan." And then the process starts all over again with national turning to the states. So we see a lot of that has been passed down, but not necessarily successful in so doing. So we've seen a lot of decentralists, those kind of focus on the states' rights issues, have tried to pass that down since the 70s, but we haven't seen a long-term success in terms of making that happen. That is really where Lincoln and FDR were more successful in trying to get central government to take hold and take responsibility for those types of things. Although Jefferson and Reagan particularly, were successful from an economic point of view in trying to pass that off in terms of in focusing the national government on different areas, such as let the national government focus on defense, and try and devolve a lot of other types of things to the states, trying to push back on education and some of the more domestic programs in that regard. So we did talk in class about this idea of unitary government, a strong central government where the national government's kind of in charge. China, France, some of the Scandinavian countries as good examples of this, Israel. Then we see the confederal form of government is kind of what we had in the Articles of Confederation. Also during the Civil War, the Confederate States of America, states really controlled the power. In a unitary government, the national government controls that power. And as we see in federalism, the idea is that the national, state, and local government are working together. It's the handshake that we talked about. The handshake in terms of that government that is cooperating and working through those various levels of federalism we talked about before, the dual, the cooperative, the marble cake, permissive, if you will. But that really is the national and state governments working together. We see this in terms of state constitutions. Maryland's giving local power to counties and cities, but it can also take that power away. It can take it back. Montgomery County has a lot of power given to it by Maryland, but it is power that is given and can be taken away, just as Virginia has a very similar model. And that's where we see the federalist approach, this idea of sticking to federalism, is more of a compromise in trying to appease the confederations that want to have a strong state government, but also want to have a strong national government to focus on the issues that Jefferson and Madison had talked about in terms of putting down a Shays Rebellion. So advantages of federalism, obviously you've got checks on the growth of tyranny. When the states have power and the central government doesn't have all of the power, you're able to check and balance because you have separate powers and branches that check that government and still keep it as a democratic function, but it is still still something that is in the hands of the powers in the hands of the people. And so if government gets out of control with it, they can pull it back in. You can look at the list in its entirety, but I mean, essentially the advantages here, the idea is that you can be unified, you can keep government closer to the people, you can encourage political participation. All of these really trying to keep factions in check, as Madison talked about in Federalist number 10, but really trying to experiment in a government that is of, by, and for the people. Now, disadvantages, it is harder to respond to problems when you've got everybody kind of weighing in, and it is harder to hold officials accountable when the blame game happens, as we talked about in the team challenge, when other people are saying, hey, well, it's their fault, the national government should have done something, and the national government says, well, the state government should have done something, and then it's kind of back and forth. And that did kind of happen with Hurricane Katrina. The national government said, well, the states weren't doing enough, and the states said, well, the national government wasn't doing enough. And so where did the fault lie? Well, it doesn't matter. People are starving, are hungry, and they're dying on the streets and drowning in some cases. And meanwhile, the state and national government's having a blame game. So another disadvantage and a critical one here is that states can kind of push the envelope in terms of violating the rights of different groups. And we've seen that with women and African Americans in terms of state laws. That are, and we've seen this in terms of also some other areas trying to bring about change, such as the legalization of marijuana, in terms of is it going too fast, too quickly, and some states saying the federal government's moving too slowly. Looking at same-sex marriage as another example, states passing it before court rules on it in the national government. So all of these are really not really a disadvantage of federalism necessarily, but really attesting to the fact that it really is an experimentation, as we talked about here. This idea of a laboratory for democracy. Should marijuana be legalized? Well, some states are trying to figure that out, and that really is a part of that federal process. Here we see a lot of other local governments we talked about. Now remember, in the Constitution, this is it. This is all that's mentioned. National and state governments have the power, and that's it. But as you can see here, there's a lot of other governments that are taking place, and people within those governments that are playing roles as government workers to help institute and make laws and enforce laws and interpret laws in many cases. We look at the powers of government in terms of delegated powers, those that are expressed as powers of the national government. Powers that are enumerated are not necessarily always delegated, because those could be reserved powers as well, enumerated being something that's spelled out. But a delegated power is a power that is given through the Constitution to the national government, to the government in Washington, so to speak. And through the Supremacy Clause, if you remember in the article of the Constitution that addresses the Supremacy Clause, the national government is supreme. We're going to see this in a case in a minute, McCulloch v. Maryland. But the idea here is when national and state government conflict, who wins? It's the national government. How often? Every time. So state governments have reserve powers, and the 10th Amendment made sure of that. Anything not spelled out as an expressed or delegated power to the national government is a power reserved to the states. There are some denied powers. One of them from our team challenge, that idea of titles of nobility. No state or national government can grant a power of titles of nobility to individuals, because it is expressly forbidden in the Constitution as a denied power. States can also not change the boundaries of their states and carve off other states through those states, and that is also a denied power. And then we have implied powers, which are, well, if we're looking at this and we're looking at this, and we can imply that through the Necessary and Proper Clause that Congress has the power to regulate commerce through the Commerce Clause, but also through the Necessary and Proper Clause. To do what they need to regulate commerce, they're going to have to tax. They're going to have to do other things that are implied in between those in terms of regulating those industries. And then inherent power is like the idea I mentioned in the team challenge. If the president is commander-in-chief and the president has the power to sign treaties, then the president also has the power to negotiate with foreign leaders and to meet with foreign leaders in terms of trying to come up with those agreements, those treaties and executive agreements, in order to bring the treaties back to get the Senate to ratify. And then there is shared power. The power to tax is a great example of a concurrent or a shared power that the national and the state government has. These are powers that they both will take part in, and taxation is definitely one of those. This we have covered in class, and we'll take a closer look in terms of the powers that the national and state government have. And you can see that here. We kind of talked about these already, but I want to go to the concurrent powers. The power to build roads and establish highways, other roads and thoroughfares. Borrowing money are powers of the national and state governments that are shared. Powers that are denied, the national government can't violate the Bill of Rights. It also cannot change states' boundaries, as I mentioned. State governments can't print or coin money. They also can't enter into treaties. They also can't suspend a person's rights without that due process that we talk about in the Fifth Amendment. State and national governments, as I mentioned, can't grant titles of nobility. They also can't permit slavery. They can't deny citizens the right to vote, although we see this a lot in terms of kind of pushing the envelope on the 15th and 19th Amendments. But national and state governments are not allowed to do those things. They are denied powers. And in terms of that implied power, as I mentioned, under the Necessary and Proper Clause or the Elastic Clause, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, focuses on the fact that because there are powers that Congress may need to regulate business and commerce, they also may need to pass laws related to those bills. They may need to establish a national bank in order to help regulate that commerce and the flow of money. So these are through these clauses that we see here that kind of open the door to other laws and other possibilities for the national government to step in. The inherent powers, as I mentioned, the idea of the president to regulate, to sign treaties and also to be commander-in-chief. But the example here of Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase, the power to acquire new territory. Well, if the president's commander-in-chief and the president can negotiate with foreign leaders in trying to get new deals, the president also can work on acquiring new territory as part of those deals. And again, that is part of the inherent power. Because something is implied in the Constitution, we assume that they also have additional powers there. This goes into more detail on those, and you can look at those in addition in terms of implied, inherent, and how that's spelled out. But a couple of things to keep in mind, that most of the power of the national government comes from these four places. If you don't hear anything else I say on this highlights, these are the four to keep in mind, because the power of the national government really comes from these four places. In terms of the power that we see today in Congress, in the president, and in the judicial branch, the power of the national government really comes through these four clauses. The first one is the Supremacy Clause, outlined in the Articles of the Constitution. The Supremacy Clause being that when national and state government conflict, who wins? The national government. How often? Every time. The War Powers Act. War power comes through this idea of, War Powers Clause, through this idea of that Congress, through Article 1, Section 8, has the power to declare war. The president has the power as commander-in-chief, and through that, they have the power of declaring war and determining who we will fight against when necessary. The Commerce Clause. Congress has the power to regulate commerce through this clause, and through this, a lot of the laws that are passed today are coming through the Commerce Clause. They are coming through here. How can Congress regulate the waterways? In Gibbons v. Ogden, as we'll look at, it's through the Commerce Clause. How does Congress have the power to regulate the internet, to put a tax on internet sales? How does Congress have the power to regulate the pharmaceutical industry? How does Congress have the power to regulate highways? All of these come through the Commerce Clause, through this idea of Congress having the power to regulate commerce. And then the last one, taxing and spending. The Taxing and Spending Clause grants the power of Congress and the President to propose that taxes be spent, or taxes be raised, revenue be generated, and that monies be spent by the national government for programs that will help the American people, that will help specific states, that will help the government as a whole, and will help specific people along the way. But the majority, and I would even go so far to say is a super majority of where the national government gets their power today is through these four clauses. And predominantly what they are taking up as issues, including Obamacare, including tax reform. You look at the debate with what's going on with North Korea. You look at the issue with Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma. All of these coming through these four particular powers that are granted to the national government. Let's talk mandates for a second. Federal mandates are these idea that the government, the national government in particular, is putting in place something that states must do. A federal mandate is the national government may or may not be funding it. Funded mandate is when the government provides money. The national government gives the states money and says, here, go do this by a certain date. Here's what we want you to put in place, and here's the money to do it. Unfortunately, more often we see unfunded mandates, or we see a funded mandate become an unfunded mandate through devolution. They're passing it down to states. They start off with money, and then the money starts to disappear. That is where Obamacare, in some cases, was established. We start to see the kind of chipping away at the funding for those programs and asking the states to take on more. The states can't take on more, which is why the concern about Medicaid funding and Medicaid programs not being financially sustainable down the road is many times the arguments that that state governors will make in terms of that mandate. So this is hugely controversial in terms of the federal government and the state government going back and forth on this issue. No Child Left Behind was a program like that. Started out as being very funded and then chipping away at the money, just like I talked about with Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. We see these unfunded mandates that continue to chip away at the requirements in terms of what is being mandated by the national government and what states are being required to do. Okay, so interstate relationships. This is an important one to take a look at. Number 10 here in the top 12 highlights. A couple of key pieces here. The full faith and credit clause basically requires that a state look at the civil judgments of other states and accept a record as valid. We don't need to go to Virginia and get a driver's license in Virginia. My driver's license will work in Virginia. And so I being deemed a citizen that can drive in Maryland can also be someone who can drive in Virginia. And this also leads into the Privileges and Immunities Clause. The idea of full faith and credit here is if a marriage, a civil judgment, a marriage has been signed off by a judge or someone who officiates and a witness, then the full faith and credit says that in those other states where you may move, you are also we give the full faith and credit to those states, and we honor those civil judgments such as marriage that would have the full force of the law. They would be recorded as valid. Privileges and immunities. The marriage license is a good example here. The driver's license is a good example here in terms of states having to give the same privileges and immunities to the people who drive in those states, not just to the people who hold a Virginia license. So if I drive in Virginia, they're not going to pull me over and say, hey, you need to get a Virginia license or you can't drive in this state. Privileges and immunities says basically that I don't need a Virginia license. They're going to honor that, and that's where the Privileges and Immunities Clause was founded. Extradition says you can extradite criminals from one state to another, and they will honor those. And interstate compacts, we see a lot of this in terms of trying to get states to work together. The Chesapeake Bay is a really good example of an interstate compact in which in terms of the regional cooperation that's happening through an interstate compact. We have Virginia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and other states that are impacted by the Chesapeake Bay and that are contributing to the Chesapeake Bay to work in terms of regional cooperation to clean it up, to keep it clean, and to secure its future. McCulloch v. Maryland, as we talked about, this is an important case. It is one of our benchmark cases. Basically, McCulloch wanted to sue because Maryland was trying to tax a national bank that was in the state of Maryland, and basically took the case to the Supreme Court saying, well, does the national government have the power to establish a national bank? The Supreme Court says yes. But do the states have the power to tax it? Under the Supremacy Clause, they do not. Because what do we know about the Supremacy Clause? When national and state government conflicts, who wins? The national government. How often? Every time. And so the Supreme Court ruled in this case for McCulloch in saying that the Supremacy Clause being enacted, the state of Maryland does not have the power to tax a national bank. And that leads us to our 12th and final highlight, preemption, which is this idea that a national law or a regulation would preempt a state law. Civil rights law, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is probably the best example. There are a lot of laws in place, black codes, Jim Crow laws that were in place in southern states. And the Civil Rights Act of 64, not the first Civil Rights Act, but the first one really with any teeth or enforcement mechanisms that really could be enacted by the national government to force states, and in many ways to force states to enforce civil rights laws, really change the game. And that's where we see preemption today in terms of a great example with the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. The idea that the national law the Affordable Care Act, would preempt any state laws or local laws that were passed in that state and would have the full force of law because of national supremacy, and that preemption would kick in. One of the places where we saw the Supreme Court weigh in on federalism was in the Gibbons v. Ogden case. I mentioned it a little bit ago. It's where we see the Commerce Clause really being used as the case that allows Congress through the Commerce Clause, but through what is necessary and proper to really interpret their power in terms of regulating the waterways. They're regulating commerce. Well, what does the national government have to do about regulating commerce? Well, in this case, they do, and it not just allows them to regulate the waterways and regulate commerce, but a pretty broad interpretation of what type of commerce is included in that, in terms of allowing them to be that lawmaking body. And this was part of the power to provide commerce and regulate commerce, as well as the power to tax through the taxing and spending clauses, is really what allowed the Affordable Care Act to move forward, and ultimately for the Supreme Court to uphold the law by saying it was constitutional because it was basically a tax. Let's look at grants for a second as we close out these highlights for the Chapter 3. Categorical grants are pretty much a formula. They've got to meet a particular formula of standards. They've got to kind of make their way through the formula or the categories, check off a box, a list of boxes, and if they do, then they will get X amount of funding. And it's usually a formula for that funding. That's why the formula grant or the categorical formula comes in. A project grant is for a specific project. They throw money at it, and that's it. It's usually a one-time gig. They can always try and renew the money, but the idea is it's thrown out there for a project and then they're done. Block grants, just basically a pot of money given to a state, not a lot of strings attached, and the state can do with it what they want as long as it's focused on the broader issue in some cases, many times education, healthcare, and that sort of thing. Now, Republicans tend to favor grants that have fewer strings attached. Democrats tend to like those more because they can get the states to change their behavior as a result of it. But states don't like a lot of rules. They don't like a lot of rules in terms of grants, so they like block grants. You may have heard in talking about the latest the latest healthcare bill, President Trump was talking about the importance of trying to give states more block grants and focus on block grants. This is why, because they have fewer strings and they can figure out what they want to do with them. But it does tend to, conservatives tend to favor that more than Democrats do. And if you look here, and you can spend more time on this on the PDF version of the highlights, but you can see that on the left we have states that give more money in federal dollars than what they're getting. In terms of what they're getting out of it. Rhode Island, for instance, here spending per dollar in terms of a dollar, and the idea is the states on the left are giving more than they get. States on the right are getting more than they give. And the funding here, New Mexico, for instance, getting $2.03 for every dollar that is spent. Rhode Island, it's a net, right? You can see ranked 33 there. But for every dollar they put in, they're getting a dollar out. So it's a net for them. New Mexico, Mississippi, Alaska, Louisiana, all of the states you see on the right here are getting more, and so in some cases a lot more than what they give. And then you can see that many of these states are pretty significant in terms of the amount of money that they're getting back from the federal government. Now, it's kind of ironic to hear some of the states like Alabama, which is very states' rights driven, and get the federal government out of it, is getting $1.66 back. I'm not so sure they would like to get the federal government, and in terms of their spending out of it, because they're getting $1.66 for every dollar they send to Washington. That's a pretty good deal for them. Kentucky, same thing. But that isn't normally what we hear from them. And so in terms of this map, do you get more back than you pay in taxes? This is a good breakdown in terms of in seeing, well, how much do people pay in taxes versus what they're receiving? And again, you can pause the video and take a closer look if you like, in terms of some of the revenues that they're giving versus what they're receiving. So some key events in terms of the in terms of the highlights in federalism that really have changed federalism over the years. The Civil War, obviously, we're giving federal pensions to soldiers. We're doing that for the first time. The Industrial Revolution, the rise of big business, is really showing the federal government in terms of regulating railroads and regulating some of the industries, putting in place some workplace safeguards and Labor Day coming out as a result of that ultimately. The Great Depression. Big federal programs, the ABC soup of the New Deal, basically coming out of that in terms of trying to get national government help in order to help people who are suffering. World War II also changing that role. We need more workers in order to make planes and ships and tanks and ammunition and weapons. And the Civil Rights era, really the national government stepping in to try and enforce the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act, and so forth. So what is the future of federalism? The answer is to be continued. We're seeing a lot of this sharing of power. Where have we seen it latest? Really, in terms of economics, this devolution back and forth between Republicans and Democrats. We've seen it in same-sex marriage or gay marriage, healthcare reform. The conversation continues, and legalization of marijuana. And so the answer is, even looking at the last 10 years, we've seen this change significantly. What's going to happen in the next 10? Who knows? But that really is the changing role of federalism, and it is a back and forth. It's not a straight step forward. Many people say, 5 steps forward, 3 steps back. But the idea is that federalism is changing that name of the game, and that relationship between national and state government continues to evolve. I hope you found this helpful for the Chapter 3 highlights, and we will see you soon. Wish you luck on the quiz and the test.